Tales by Ebi. In the bustling city of Lagos, there lived a young woman named Amaka. She was married to a wealthy man, Chief Alu, who owned several businesses across the city. They lived in a big house in Lekki, and Amaka drove expensive cars, all bought by her husband. On the outside, Amaka's life looked perfect, and everyone in their neighborhood admired her. Women would often whisper to one another, saying, "I wish I had a life like Amaka's." Little did they know that behind the big smiles and fancy clothes, Amaka was deeply unhappy. Amaka's troubles began soon after her marriage to Chief Alu. Though her husband was rich, he was very controlling. He picked out the clothes she wore, decided which friends she could talk to, and even told her how she should style her hair. Most of the beautiful things she had were not gifts from him but hand-me-downs from her friend, Bisi. Bisi, who lived in the same estate, always gave Amaka her used clothes and wigs because Amaka couldn't afford to buy new ones on her own. No one knew that Amaka was living in misery. While people in the estate admired her life, they didn't know that she was constantly asking Bisi for help, begging for things a grown woman should be able to buy for herself. Her husband, Chief Alu, would give her only a little money, just enough for her to get by, but never enough for her to feel independent. Amaka grew up in a small village in Anambra State. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okeke, were poor farmers who struggled to make ends meet. They had 5 children, and Amaka was the oldest. Even though they had very little, Mr. and Mrs. Okeke worked hard to make sure Amaka finished school. They sold almost everything they had just to send her to the university in Lagos. Amaka knew how much her parents sacrificed, so she worked very hard in school, hoping to one day change her family's fortune. When she graduated with a good degree, her parents were proud of her. They believed Amaka was going to get a good job and take care of her younger siblings. After her graduation, she returned to the village, and her parents welcomed her warmly. That night, her father called her outside to sit with him under the stars. "Amaka," he began, "we have done our best to give you an education. Now, it is your turn to help your brothers and sisters. They look up to you. You must find a good job in the city and start sending money home. We sold all we had to make sure you finished school." Amaka felt a deep sense of responsibility. She loved her family and wanted to help, but finding a job in Lagos was not as easy as her father thought. She returned to Lagos with hopes of securing a good-paying job, but after many months of searching, she found nothing. It seemed every company she applied to either didn't want to hire her or wanted her to do something inappropriate in exchange for a job. Amaka was determined not to compromise her values. One day, her friend Bisi invited her to a party where she met Chief Alu. He was much older than Amaka, but he showed interest in her immediately. He was charming, rich, and promised to take care of her and her family. Amaka, tired of the financial struggles, thought this was the solution to all her problems. Soon after, they got married, and her family rejoiced. They believed their daughter had married into wealth and that their suffering was over. But after the wedding, Amaka's life became more difficult. Chief Alu was not the kind and caring man she thought he was. He controlled her every move, never allowed her to work, and stopped her from visiting her family as often as she wanted. The chief also had a temper, and on days when he was upset, he would yell at her for the smallest mistakes. Amaka's once bright spirit began to dim. Months passed, and Amaka's parents started to ask her for money. They needed funds to send her younger siblings to school, but Amaka didn't have enough. She couldn't even tell them the truth about her situation. How could she explain that despite being married to a wealthy man, she had no freedom and no money of her own? Her heart grew heavy as the pressure mounted. One day, Bisi noticed Amaka was unusually quiet and sad. "What's going on, Amaka?" Bisi asked as they sat together in Amaka's living room. "You're not your usual self." Amaka sighed, fighting back tears. "Bisi, I don't know what to do anymore. Everyone thinks my life is perfect, but I'm suffering. My husband gives me no freedom, no money, and now my family is asking me for help, but I can't even help myself." Bisi was shocked. "But you live in a big house, drive expensive cars. All that is just for show," Amaka interrupted. "I have nothing of my own. Everything I wear, everything I use, is either from my husband or something you gave me." Bisi was silent for a moment, thinking of what to say. Finally, she said, Amaka, you have to take control of your life. This isn't right. You're a smart woman. You deserve more than this. I know, Amaka whispered, but what can I do? Before BC could respond, the door opened, and Chief Alu walked in, looking angry. Chief Alu stormed into the living room, his face twisted in anger. His eyes darted from BC to Amaka, and then back to BC. What is she doing here again? He barked, glaring at Amaka. Amaka's heart raced, and she quickly stood up. She just came to check on me, Chief, Amaka replied nervously, trying to keep her voice steady. We were just talking. Chief Alu's face darkened. Talking about what? Do you think I don't know you two always gossip behind my back? He turned his gaze toward BC. And you, BC, this is the last time you'll come to this house without my permission. Leave now. BC stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. Chief, there's no need to shout. I was just checking on my friend. I'll leave, but this isn't the way to treat Amaka. Chief Alu's lips curled into a sneer. How I treat my wife is none of your business. Now, get out. BC glanced at Amaka one last time, her face filled with concern. Amaka, call me if you need anything, okay? She said softly before walking out of the house. As soon as the door closed, Chief Alu turned to Amaka, his eyes blazing with anger. I told you I don't like that woman around here. What were you two talking about? Amaka could feel her knees trembling. She knew that whatever she said next could make things worse. Nothing important, she said quickly, trying to avoid his gaze. Just women's talk. Chief Alu stepped closer to her, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. Don't lie to me, Amaka. If I find out you've been telling her anything about our home, you'll regret it. Do you understand? Amaka nodded quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. I understand, she whispered. Good, he said, stepping back. Now, go and make sure dinner is ready. I have a business meeting tonight. Amaka hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her situation pressing down on her even harder now. BC was right, this wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. But what could she do? She felt trapped in a marriage that gave her nothing but heartache. That night, as Chief Alu left for his meeting, Amaka sat alone in the living room, staring at the ceiling. Her mind drifted back to her family in the village. She thought about how her parents had placed all their hopes on her, and how they must think she was living a perfect life. If only they knew the truth. As she sat there lost in thought, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from her younger brother, Chaka. Amaka, we need your help. School fees are due, and Papa says we don't have the money. What are we going to do? Amaka's heart sank. She had nothing to send them. Her allowance from Chief Alu was barely enough to buy her basic necessities, and he would never agree to send money to her family. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. How had her life gotten so bad? The next morning, Amaka woke up with a heavy heart. She knew she had to do something, but what? Her thoughts kept going back to BC's words, you have to take control of your life. But how? Later that day, while Chief Alu was out again, Amaka decided to visit BC. She needed someone to talk to, and BC was the only person she trusted. When she arrived at BC's house, she was warmly welcomed. They sat in the living room, and Amaka poured out her heart. BC, I can't do this anymore, Amaka said, her voice shaking. I feel like I'm suffocating in that house. Chief doesn't let me have a life of my own. He treats me like I'm a prisoner. BC listened quietly, nodding as Amaka spoke. When she finished, BC sighed. Amaka, I've been telling you for months now you need to leave him. You don't deserve this. There are places you can go. Shelters, women's groups. You don't have to stay. Amaka shook her head. But where would I go? I have no money, no job. And what about my family? They still think I'm living the dream. If I leave, how will I help them? BC frowned. I understand, but you have to think about yourself too. This man is destroying you, Amaka. What happens when it gets worse? You've already seen how angry he gets. What if one day, She didn't finish the sentence, but Amaka knew what she meant. The thought sent a chill down her spine. For the next few minutes, the two friends sat in silence. Then Bisi suddenly spoke up. "I know someone who can help," she said quietly. Amaka looked up. "Who?" "There's this lawyer I know," Bisi said. "His name is Barrister Chinedu. He helps women in situations like yours. He could help you get out of this marriage." Amaka stared at Bisi, unsure. "Do you really think he could help me?" Bisi nodded. "He's helped others before. He's a good man. I can arrange a meeting for you." Amaka felt a flicker of hope in her chest. Could this be the way out? Could this barrister really help her escape from Chief Alu's control? But just as she was about to say yes, the front door opened, and Chief Alu walked in. He had come home early, and the look on his face was anything but friendly. Chief Alu stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Amaka sitting with Bisi. His sudden arrival sent a wave of panic through Amaka. She quickly stood up, but her legs felt like jelly. "What are you doing here, Amaka?" Chief Alu asked, his voice calm but cold, the kind of calm that always made Amaka nervous. I came to see Bisi," Amaka stammered. She knew there was no point in lying, but she also didn't want to provoke him. Chief Alu's gaze shifted to Bisi. "I thought I told you to stay away from my wife." Bisi, always bold and unafraid, met his gaze without flinching. "Amaka is my friend, and you can't stop her from seeing me. You may control her at home, but not here." Chief Alu's face hardened, and Amaka's heart raced. She knew what was coming next. He took a step toward Bisi, but Amaka quickly moved between them. "Please, Chief, let's go home. We can talk about this later," Amaka pleaded, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. Chief Alu paused for a moment, his eyes flicking between Amaka and Bisi. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving the door wide open behind him. Amaka let out a shaky breath, relieved that things hadn't gotten worse. But she knew the calm wouldn't last. "I have to go," she whispered, grabbing her bag. Bisi stood up and grabbed her arm gently. "Amaka, you don't have to go back with him. Stay here with me tonight. We can call Barrister Chinedu tomorrow, and he can help you." Amaka shook her head. "I can't. If I don't go home, it'll only make things worse. I need more time to figure this out." Bisi frowned but let go of her arm. "Promise me you'll think about what I said. You can't keep living like this." "I promise," Amaka whispered, though deep down, she wasn't sure what to do. She left Bisi's house and walked home slowly, her mind racing with thoughts. Could Barrister Chinedu really help her? Could she actually leave Chief Alu and start over? But what about her family? They were still expecting her to send money, and she didn't even know how they would react if she told them the truth about her marriage. When Amaka arrived home, the house was dark. She entered cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked through the hallway toward the living room, expecting to see Chief Alu waiting for her, but he wasn't there. The house was eerily quiet. As she made her way to the bedroom, she saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Amaka froze, unsure of what to say. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. "Amaka," Chief Alu's voice was low, almost calm. He didn't look up as he spoke. "Do you think I don't know what you're planning?" Her heart skipped a beat. Did he know about Barrister Chinedu? About her plan to leave? "I don't know what you mean," Amaka replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Chief Alu finally looked up at her, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you can just leave me? You think you can walk out of this house and live your life without me?" His voice grew louder with each word, and Amaka took a step back. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said softly, but her voice shook with fear. Chief Alu stood up and took a step toward her, his tall frame towering over her. "You are my wife, Amaka. You belong to me. Everything you have, everything your family has, is because of me. If you ever think about leaving, I will make sure you have nothing. Do you understand?" Amaka felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She nodded, too afraid to speak. Chief Alu stared at her for a moment longer before turning away. "Now, go to bed. And stop seeing that Bisi. I won't warn you again." Amaka nodded silently and made her way to the other side of the bed. She lay down, her back turned to him, and stared at the wall, her mind racing. As she lay there in the darkness, Amaka's thoughts drifted back to Bisi and Barrister Chinedu. She knew now more than ever that she needed to get out, but how? Chief Alu had made it clear that he wouldn't let her go easily. She felt trapped, but deep inside, a small flicker of hope remained. Maybe Barrister Chinedu could help her find a way out. Maybe there was still a chance for her to escape this nightmare and start a new life. But it wouldn't be easy, and she would have to be careful. As she drifted off to sleep, her mind made up, she knew that the days ahead would be filled with danger and uncertainty. But Amaka was determined to find a way, no matter how long it took. The next morning, Amaka woke up to find Chief Alu already gone. He often left early for business meetings or trips, leaving her to spend the day alone in the big, empty house. Normally, the quiet brought her little comfort, but today, it felt different. Today, she had a plan. Amaka took her phone and sent a quick message to Bisi. I'm ready to meet Barrister Chinedu. Can we arrange it for today? Within a few minutes, Bisi replied, of course. I'll contact him and let you know the time. Stay strong, Amaka. Amaka felt a surge of nervous energy. This could be the first step toward regaining control of her life. But as the excitement built, so did the fear. What if Chief Alu found out? What if she couldn't go through with it? She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. She had to be brave. Later that afternoon, Bisi sent her the details. Barrister Chinedu would meet them at his office at 3 p.m. Amaka quickly got dressed, choosing simple clothes that wouldn't attract too much attention. She didn't want anyone in the estate to notice her leaving, especially if Chief Alu had spies watching her. Amaka left the house quietly and walked to the gate. The gatekeeper greeted her with a nod, not suspecting anything unusual. Once outside, she quickly hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address Bisi had sent her. As the taxi wove through the busy Lagos streets, Amaka's mind raced. She tried to calm herself by looking out the window, watching people go about their daily lives. But the knot in her stomach only tightened. What if this didn't work? What if Barrister Chinedu couldn't help her? When the taxi pulled up in front of a modest office building, Amaka stepped out and spotted Bisi waiting for her near the entrance. Bisi waved her over, and they walked inside together. Are you okay? Bisi asked as they took the elevator to the second floor. Amaka nodded, though her heart was still pounding. I'm just nervous. What if Chief finds out? Bisi gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry. Barrister Chinedu knows what he's doing. He's helped other women in worse situations than yours. You just have to trust the process. They walked into Barrister Chinedu's office, where the lawyer was already seated behind his desk. He was a tall, middle-aged man with a calm, steady demeanor that instantly put Amaka at ease. He stood up and greeted them warmly before motioning for them to sit. Amaka, Bisi has told me a little about your situation, Barrister Chinedu began, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. But I'd like to hear everything from you. Tell me exactly what's been happening. Amaka took a deep breath and began to explain everything, how Chief Alu had been controlling her, how he had isolated her from her family and friends, and how he had threatened her if she ever tried to leave. She told him about the financial strain, how she had no money of her own, and how her family relied on her. As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes, but she kept going. This was her chance to finally be heard. Barrister Chinedu listened carefully, nodding every now and then, but he didn't interrupt. When Amaka finished, he leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. You're in a difficult situation, Amaka, he said slowly. But it's not hopeless. I've dealt with men like your husband before. It's going to take time, but we can build a case against him. The domestic abuse and the control he's exerting over you are strong grounds for legal action. We can work on getting you a separation and, if necessary, a divorce. But we need to be strategic about it. Amaka felt a mix of relief and anxiety. But what about my family? If I leave, how will I take care of them? And what if he tries to take everything from me? Barrister Chinedu smiled gently. I understand your concerns. We'll make sure you have financial support. Your husband has money, and you're entitled to a share of it, especially if there's a divorce. As for your family, I can help you set up a legal structure where a portion of his wealth will go toward supporting them, especially if they're dependent on you. But we'll need to gather evidence of his abuse. Have you been keeping records of anything? Amaka shook her head. I didn't think to keep anything. But he's hit me before, and he's always controlling where I go. Barrister Chinedu nodded. That's okay. From now on, start keeping track of everything. Save any threatening messages, record your conversations if you can, and write down any incidents where he's abusive. We need a solid case. Amaka bit her lip, thinking about how risky this would be. But it was her only chance. I'll do it, she said finally. I'll start gathering the evidence. Good, Barrister Chinedu said. Now, we'll also need to set up a safe place for you to go if things get dangerous. I can arrange for you to stay in a women's shelter or a safe house, but that's only if you feel like you're in immediate danger. You don't have to decide that right now. Amaka nodded, feeling a little better now that there was a plan in place. They discussed a few more details before leaving the office. As Amaka and BC walked out into the bright afternoon sun, Amaka felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. But as they walked toward the street to catch a taxi, a familiar black car pulled up in front of them. Amaka's heart stopped. It was Chief Alu's car. The window rolled down, and Chief Alu was sitting in the back seat, his eyes locked on Amaka. What are you doing here? He asked in a calm, dangerous voice. Amaka froze, her mind racing. How had he found her? What would she do now? Amaka's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen on the sidewalk. Chief Alu's eyes were locked on her, piercing and cold. BC, sensing the tension, quickly stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Chief, we were just out running some errands, BC said, her hand lightly gripping Amaka's arm, as if to steady her. Is there a problem? Chief Alu ignored BC, his gaze never leaving Amaka. He opened the door of the car and stepped out, his polished shoes making a sharp sound against the pavement. He approached slowly, a hint of a smile on his face that sent a chill down Amaka's spine. Amaka, why didn't you tell me you'd be out today? He asked, his voice eerily calm. I just needed to run some errands, Amaka stammered, trying to find the right words. I didn't think it was important. Chief Alu's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. Everything you do is important to me, my dear wife, he said, his tone low and threatening. He glanced at BC, then back to Amaka. Get in the car. We're going home. Amaka's heart raced. She looked at BC, who gave her a subtle nod, as if telling her to stay calm. But everything inside Amaka screamed to run, to escape. She could feel the walls closing in around her. No, Amaka said quietly, barely believing the word had come out of her mouth. Chief Alu's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of disbelief. What did you say? He asked, stepping closer. Amaka took a deep breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. I said no, she repeated, her voice trembling but steady. BC stepped in between them, her hand held up to stop Chief Alu from getting any closer. Chief, I think you need to calm down, she said firmly. Amaka has every right to decide where she goes and who she sees. Chief Alu's eyes flickered with anger. Stay out of this, BC. This is between me and my wife. BC didn't back down. I won't stay out of it. Amaka is my friend, and I won't let you bully her. Chief Alu took a step back, his face darkening. For a moment, Amaka thought he might lash out at BC, but instead, he turned back to her. Amaka, get in the car, he demanded, his voice now laced with barely controlled fury. Amaka's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay still. She couldn't let him control her anymore. I'm not going with you, she said, her voice firmer this time. I need space, and I need time to think. Chief Alu's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, Amaka saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, he forced a smile onto his face. Very well, he said, his tone suddenly smooth. Take your time. But don't forget who takes care of you, Amaka. Don't forget where you belong. He turned and walked back to his car without another word. The engine roared to life, and within moments, he sped off down the street. Amaka stood still, her whole body trembling. She had never stood up to him like that before. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over her, and her legs felt like they might give way beneath her. BC put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did great, Amaka," she said softly. "But you need to be careful. He won't let this go." Amaka nodded, knowing BC was right. Chief Alu would never give up that easily. She could already feel the storm brewing. He would come back, and when he did, it would be worse. "We need to move quickly," BC continued, glancing around as if expecting Chief Alu to return at any moment. "Barrister Chinedu will know what to do next. We'll file the papers as soon as possible and make sure you're safe." Amaka swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She had taken the first step toward freedom, but it felt like the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous road. She wasn't sure what Chief Alu would do next, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't go back to that house. As BC called a taxi to take them to a safer location, Amaka stared down the street where Chief Alu had driven off. She knew she had made the right choice, but the fear still lingered. A few minutes later, the taxi arrived, and they climbed in. As the car pulled away, Amaka leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had no idea how this would all end, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. As the taxi sped through the busy streets of Lagos, Amaka couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping over her. Even though she had taken a stand, the reality of the danger she faced felt overwhelming. BC sat beside her, offering comfort with her presence, but the silence between them was thick with worry. "We'll be at Barrister Chinedu's office soon," BC said quietly, her voice gentle yet firm. "He'll help you figure out the next steps." Amaka nodded, her mind still reeling from the confrontation with Chief Alu. She had never stood up to him like that before, and while part of her felt proud, another part of her was terrified of what might happen next. Chief Alu wasn't the kind of man to take defiance lightly. When they reached Barrister Chinedu's office, the lawyer welcomed them in with a calm, reassuring smile. "I'm glad you came back so quickly," he said, guiding them to sit. "I'm ready to proceed with your case, Amaka, but I want to make sure you fully understand what's ahead. Once we file the legal papers for separation, Chief Alu may retaliate. Are you prepared for that?" Amaka swallowed hard but nodded. "I don't have any other choice. I can't live like this anymore." Barrister Chinedu leaned forward, his tone serious. "Good. We'll request a court order for protection, so he can't come near you while we work through the legal process. But until we have that, you need to stay somewhere safe." BC immediately chimed in. "Amaka can stay with me until the paperwork is processed." "Excellent," Barrister Chinedu said, scribbling notes. "Now, we'll also work on securing financial support for you. As his wife, you're entitled to a share of his wealth. We'll push for that in the divorce proceedings." For the first time in weeks, Amaka felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least there was a plan, and she wasn't alone. Barrister Chinedu outlined the next steps carefully, making sure Amaka understood everything. They signed the necessary documents, and Amaka left the office with a sense of relief. She wasn't free yet, but she was on her way. The days that followed were filled with tension. Amaka stayed at BC's house, anxiously awaiting any news. Chief Alu called her several times, but she didn't pick up. Each time her phone rang, her stomach clenched with fear, but BC reminded her that they were taking the right steps. A week later, the court granted a temporary protection order, barring Chief Alu from contacting Amaka or coming near her. The divorce proceedings would take time, but this was the first major victory. With Barrister Chinedu's help, Amaka also began to regain control of her finances. The money Chief Alu had kept from her was slowly being accessed, giving her the chance to support herself and her family. But Chief Alu wasn't finished. One evening, as Amaka and BC returned from the market, they found the gate to BC's house broken and the front door wide open. Inside, everything was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and valuable items were missing. It was clear that someone had broken in. Amaka's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. Chief Alu had sent someone to scare them. He couldn't get to her directly, but he was sending a message. "We need to call Barrister Chinedu," BC said, her voice shaking. "This is serious." Amaka nodded, but fear gripped her. What if Chief Alu escalated his threats? What if he did something worse? The next day, Barrister Chinedu filed a police report and reinforced the protection order. He assured Amaka that Chief Alu's actions would only strengthen her case, but the fear still lingered. Amaka knew that the battle was far from over. Over the next few months, the legal battle continued. Chief Alu fought hard, trying to regain control, but Barrister Chinedu stood firm, defending Amaka's rights. In the end, the court granted Amaka a divorce, and Chief Alu was ordered to pay financial support. The protection order remained in place, ensuring that he couldn't come near her again. Though the road had been long and painful, Amaka had finally broken free. Moral lessons. 1. Courage in the face of adversity. Amaka's story shows that sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones fought for personal freedom. Even when fear and uncertainty seem overwhelming, taking a stand against abuse and control is the first step toward reclaiming one's life. 2. The importance of seeking help. Amaka's decision to trust BC and seek legal help was crucial in her journey. No one should face abuse alone, and seeking support from friends, family, or professionals can be the key to finding a way out. 3. All that glitters is not gold. Just like Amaka's outwardly glamorous life hid her pain and suffering, it's important to remember that appearances can be deceiving. Envying others without knowing their true struggles can lead to misplaced admiration. 4. Perseverance and patience. Amaka's battle for freedom wasn't won overnight. It took time, patience, and resilience to overcome the challenges she faced. Her story reminds us that difficult situations don't resolve quickly, but persistence pays off in the end. 5. Self-worth is priceless. Amaka's journey teaches that no amount of wealth or luxury can replace the value of self-respect and personal freedom. Knowing your worth and refusing to tolerate abuse is the foundation of a healthy life.